No alien soldier could win her heart until a human showed true courage. Part 1. The Galactic Summit on Station Verada. The station was massive. It hung in space like a small city made of metal and light, turning slowly above a giant orange and violet planet that no one had ever given a proper name. They just called it the gas giant. The station above it was called Verada, and on this particular cycle, it was the most important place in the known galaxy. Delegates from 31 civilizations had come to Verada. Some came in warships. Some came in sleek diplomatic vessels with golden hulls. Some came in transport ships so old they groaned at every docking clamp. But they all came because the alternative was war. A real one, a long one, the kind that burns entire star systems and leaves nothing behind but silence and floating debris. Lieutenant Colonel Nathan Graves came on a standard military transport with 11 other crew members, a bag of personal gear, and a thermos of coffee that had gone cold somewhere past the second relay station. He was not the most impressive figure to step off a ship that day. He was average height, average build, with short brown hair, calm gray eyes, and the kind of face that people tended to forget unless they paid close attention. He wore his uniform neatly, but without ceremony. He carried his own bag. Nobody gave him a second look. That was fine with him. Nathan had been assigned as Earth's military liaison for the Tricycle Peace Accords. His job was to oversee joint security on the station, coordinate between alien guard units, and make sure that none of the 31 delegations ended up pointing weapons at each other in a hallway. It was, in the words of his commanding officer back on Earth, a job that required more patience than firepower. Nathan had both. He preferred the patience. The station's main concourse was loud and overwhelming when he arrived. Keth warriors stood in clusters near the eastern docking bays, their armored exoskeletons gleaming under the artificial light. They were nearly 8 feet tall, broad across the chest, with 4 arms and eyes that were completely black. They spoke in low rumbles that vibrated through the floor. Every one of them wore enough visible weaponry to start a small conflict on their own. They moved through the crowd, and the crowd moved out of their way without being asked. The Sorvani were different. They were roughly human-shaped, 2 arms, 2 legs, upright posture. But their skin shifted color the way deep ocean water catches light. When they were calm, they were a soft blue-gray. When they were thinking hard, faint threads of silver ran across their faces and hands. When they were angry, they went a deep, cold green. They did not show fear, or so everyone said. Nathan wasn't sure he believed that about any living creature, but he kept the thought to himself. Commander Lyra Voss was the first Sorvani he was formally introduced to, and she made it clear within 30 seconds that she considered the introduction a waste of her time. She was standing near the joint security briefing table with 3 of her officers when Nathan walked in. She looked at him the way someone looks at a piece of furniture that has been placed in the wrong room. Her skin was a calm silver blue. Her eyes were dark and sharp and measuring. She was dressed in a fitted Sorvani combat uniform, dark gray, with a faint blue trim at the collar, and she wore no unnecessary decoration, just rank markings, clean and simple. He respected that, actually. "You are the human liaison," she said. It was not a question. It was the kind of statement that had a quiet judgment folded into it. "Nathan Graves," he said, and offered his hand. She looked at the hand. Among Sorvani, physical contact with someone you had not yet earned trust with was considered presumptuous. Nathan had read that in the briefing files. He lowered his hand without embarrassment and gave a small, respectful nod instead. She blinked once. That, apparently, she had not expected. "You read the cultural files," she said. "I read all the files," he said. She looked at him for another moment, then turned back to the briefing table. "Your security rotation begins at the 6th hour. Do not be late. Human timekeeping has a poor reputation on this station." Nathan said nothing to that. He simply noted the time, found his assigned station on the map, and went to introduce himself to the rest of the joint security team. Over the next 2 days, he worked quietly and without complaint. He took the early rotations without being asked. He learned the layout of the station quickly, mapping it in his head the way soldiers learn terrain, exits, bottlenecks, sightlines, shadows. He introduced himself to the lower-ranked guards from every species, not just the commanders, because in his experience, it was always the junior people who knew where the real problems were hiding. He also noticed, on the second day, that the food allocation system for the smaller delegations had been entered incorrectly into the station's supply roster. 3 minor species were going to receive the wrong nutrient compounds at the next meal cycle. For 2 of them, it was simply unpleasant. For the third, it was potentially dangerous. He found the station quartermaster, a nervous Veloon with 6 fingers on each hand, explained the error calmly, helped correct the entries, and said nothing about it to anyone else. He did not know that Lyra had been watching from the upper corridor when he did it. That evening, during a break in the security rotation, she approached him near the observation window at the end of Corridor 7. The gas giant glowed below them, amber and slow and enormous. "You corrected the supply allocation error," she said. "Someone had to," he said. "It was not your responsibility. The quartermaster's office handles station logistics," she said. "The quartermaster didn't notice it," Nathan said simply. "Someone could have gotten hurt." Lyra studied him. Her skin shifted slightly. A faint thread of silver moved across her jaw and disappeared. She said nothing for a moment. "You did not report it to command," she said. "You did not put it in the joint security log." "It wasn't a security issue," Nathan said simply. "Someone could have gotten hurt. It was just a mistake that needed fixing." She looked at him for a long moment with those dark, measuring eyes. Then she turned back to the window and the gas giant below. "You are a strange soldier," she said. "I've been told that," Nathan said. He almost smiled. She did not respond to that. But she did not leave either, and they stood at the window in silence for a few minutes, before the rotation bell called them back to their posts. That night, Nathan sat in his small assigned quarters and reviewed the security logs from the past 48 hours. Something was bothering him. A small pattern he couldn't quite name yet. 2 equipment calibration errors in restricted zones. A ventilation fault near the main negotiation hall that the station engineers had logged as routine. A delegate's personal communication unit going offline for 11 minutes and then coming back without explanation. Each thing on its own was nothing. Together, they made the back of his neck feel cold. He opened an encrypted channel to his commanding officer back on Earth and typed a short message. He did not claim anything. He did not raise an alarm. He simply said, "Something feels off on this station. I am watching it." Then he closed the channel, finished his cold coffee, and went to sleep. Outside, Station Verada turned slowly above the gas giant, full of soldiers and diplomats and secrets, and the peace accords had not yet begun to fall apart. But somewhere in the dark corridors below the main decks, something was already moving. No alien soldier could win her heart until a human showed true courage. Part 2. The Human Who Does Not Posture. The third day on Station Verada started with noise. 2 Keth guards and a Sorvani analyst had gotten into a confrontation near the secondary briefing room. Nobody had drawn a weapon yet, but the Keth had puffed up their chest plates in that particular way that meant weapons were about 30 seconds away from being drawn. The Sorvani analyst, a young officer named Kale, who had more pride than sense, was not backing down. His skin had gone a sharp cold green. Nathan arrived before either commanding officer. He had been passing through the corridor on his way to the equipment room and simply heard the rising pitch of the argument through the wall. He stepped in, looked at the situation for about 2 seconds, and then said, in a perfectly calm voice, something that nobody expected. "Okay, this is clearly about the seating arrangement in briefing room 4. Everyone stopped. "Because I moved the chairs this morning," Nathan continued, "and I moved them the wrong way for both your customs simultaneously. which means I managed to accidentally insult everyone in this corridor with one bad furniture decision. That's actually impressive when you think about it. The Keth guards stared at him. The Sorvani analyst blinked. One of the other Keth made a sound that, according to the cultural files, was the rough equivalent of a short, surprised laugh. The confrontation dissolved. Nathan apologized to both sides, genuinely and specifically, promised to fix the seating arrangement, and was gone in under 4 minutes. He did fix the chairs. He also left a small written note for the Sorvani analyst explaining the Keth cultural significance of open center space in meeting rooms, and left a separate note for the Keth guards explaining the Sorvani custom of elevated seating for analysts as a sign of intellectual respect. Not to score points, just because it seemed useful for the next 30 days of shared space. Lyra heard about it from Kale later that afternoon. Kale described the human as strange. She agreed. But she was thinking about it differently than he was. She had spent her career surrounded by soldiers who performed. Keth warriors performed strength. Sorvani officers performed precision. The high generals of the Dorvani performed wealth and legacy. Every suitor she had ever encountered, and there had been several, from species across the quadrant, had performed something for her benefit. Titles, combat records, political connections. They all wanted her to see them at their best, their biggest, their most impressive. Nathan Graves did not appear to be performing anything. He corrected supply errors when nobody was watching. He defused arguments when it was not his responsibility. He worked the early shifts without complaint, and then worked the late shifts without complaint, and as far as she could tell, complained about nothing at all in between. He was not quiet because he was weak. He was quiet because he simply did not feel the need to fill every space with the sound of himself. She found herself watching him more than she intended to. On the 4th day, she observed him spend 20 minutes talking to a junior Valoon maintenance worker who was struggling with a pressure seal in the lower corridor. Nathan did not call engineering. He sat down on the floor beside the worker, looked at the mechanism, asked a few questions, and then helped figure it out. When it was done, he nodded to the worker and moved on. The maintenance worker watched him go with an expression that Lyra recognized across species. It was the look of someone who had not expected to be treated like they mattered. That evening, during a joint security review, Lyra presented her team's updated threat assessment for the summit. She was thorough and precise, as always. When she finished, she noticed Nathan had been taking notes in a small handwritten format, which was unusual. Most liaison officers use station terminals. "You write by hand," she said, after the others had left. "Old habit," he said. "I remember things better when I write them." She looked at his notes. They were neat, abbreviated, and organized in a way that was clearly personal shorthand. She noticed, near the bottom of the page, a small notation that read, Corridor 7L. Ventilation fault logged, Day 1. Still not repaired. Check station engineer's schedule. She looked at that notation for a moment. "You are still watching the ventilation fault," she said. "I am," he said. "The engineers logged it as routine." "They did," he agreed. "But you don't believe it is routine." He looked at her. "Do you?" She was quiet for a moment. She had in fact run her own check on that ventilation fault 2 days ago and found nothing conclusive. But the fact that it had not been repaired still bothered her. She had not put it in any report because she did not have enough to justify it. "I have no evidence to suggest otherwise," she said carefully. "Neither do I," Nathan said. "That's why I'm still watching it." She sat down across from him at the table, which surprised her slightly. She had not intended to stay. "In Sorvani command structure," she said, "an officer who raises concerns without evidence is considered disruptive." "In Earth command structure too," Nathan said. "That's why I haven't raised it officially. I'm just watching. And if you find something, then I raise it officially." She studied him. Most soldiers would have either ignored it or reported it loudly to demonstrate their diligence. "I know," he said. He did not say it critically, just as a plain fact. Lyra looked down at his notes again. She thought about the dozens of decorated warriors who had sought her attention over the years. Generals who could recite their battle records from memory. Commanders who had presented her with the skulls of enemies as tokens of esteem, which she found deeply unpleasant. Officers who spoke endlessly about their own valor, as if she were an audience they needed to convince. She thought about this quiet human sitting on a cold corridor floor, helping a maintenance worker with a pressure seal. She thought about the note he had left for Kale. She said nothing of what she was thinking. She simply reviewed the threat assessment documents with him for the next hour. And when they disagreed, which happened twice, he listened to her reasoning fully before responding. And once, he changed his position because her argument was better, and said so plainly. She could not remember the last time someone had done that without making it feel like a performance of humility. When they finished, Nathan gathered his handwritten notes, said goodnight in the Sorvani formal farewell phrase, which he pronounced correctly, which required a slight lip movement that most non-Sorvani never bothered to learn, and left. Lyra sat alone at the table for a minute. Her skin was doing something she noticed only when she pressed her fingertips to her wrist. A faint, warm gold. Just a trace. Just a flicker. She pressed it down, stood up, and went back to work. On the fifth day, Nathan found something. Not the ventilation fault. That was still quiet. What he found was smaller and more worrying. A delegate's access record showed 4 separate entry attempts to a maintenance sublevel that had nothing near it of any diplomatic value. Each attempt had been logged and then quietly deleted. The deletions were clean, but not perfect. A human data analyst back on Earth might have missed it. Nathan had worked intelligence attachments for 6 years before the liaison posting. He did not miss it. He sat with the information for 3 hours, building a picture. Then he sent a second encrypted message to Earth. This one was longer than the first. It ended with, "I think someone on this station does not want these talks to succeed. I am being careful. Will update when I have more." He did not tell Lyra yet. He did not have enough. He refused to point at shadows and call them enemies. He needed to be sure. Outside, the peace accords entered their second week, and the negotiating halls filled with careful words and careful smiles. And somewhere in the maintenance levels of Station Verada, something was preparing to move. No alien soldier could win her heart until a human showed true courage. Part 3. Crisis in the Negotiation Hall. The 10th day of the summit was supposed to be the most important one. After 9 days of smaller sessions, side meetings, cultural presentations, and careful diplomatic maneuvering, the lead negotiators from the Keth Empire and the Sorvani Confederacy were finally going to sit in the same room together. This was the session that actually mattered. Everything before it had been preparation. This meeting, if it went well, would form the foundation of a peace agreement that could hold for a generation. The main negotiation hall was a wide circular room on the upper level of the station, with a long curved table at its center, and seating along the walls for observers and security personnel. The ceiling was transparent, and the gas giant below filled the entire sky with its slow amber swirl. Someone had designed it that way on purpose. Hard to talk about war when you are sitting under something that beautiful and that indifferent. Nathan arrived early and walked the room twice. He checked the exits. He noted the positions of the security officers assigned to each delegation. He looked at the ventilation panels in the upper walls, still showing no fault, still unreplaced. He noted that the lead Sorvani negotiator, a senior official named Vara, had placed a small photograph on the table in front of her position. In it, 2 young Sorvani children sat in a garden of blue-leafed plants, laughing. He noticed it the way he noticed everything. Quietly, without comment, and it settled somewhere in the back of his mind, without him quite knowing why. The session began. The room filled slowly with delegates, observers, and security staff. The Keth lead negotiator entered last, as was their custom, with 4 armed warriors as escort. They took their positions with the kind of deliberate heaviness that made the floor seem to shift. The Sorvani delegation was already seated, silver calm and precise. Lyra stood along the side wall with her security team, eyes moving steadily across the room. Nathan stood near the eastern wall, close to one of the secondary exits, and watched. For the first 40 minutes, the session proceeded carefully. Words were measured, translations were checked. There were 2 moments of visible tension, a disagreement over territorial buffer zones, and a pointed remark from a Keth junior officer that had to be formally walked back, but nothing broke. The room held. Then the lights went out. Not a flicker, not a warning. A full sudden blackout that dropped the entire negotiation hall into darkness, with only the faint glow of the gas giant coming through the ceiling above. Several delegates made sharp sounds. Someone knocked over a chair. The emergency lighting, dim red strips along the floor, came on after 3 seconds that felt much longer. Then the explosion hit. It was not in the hall itself. It was 2 levels below, and the force of it came up through the floor as a deep, rolling vibration that shook the table and rattled the ceiling panels. Dust fell. Someone screamed in a language Nathan didn't know. Then the doors on the western side of the hall blew open. 3 figures in dark, unmarked gear came through fast. They were not any species Nathan recognized immediately. They were wearing full coverage suits and helmets, deliberately unidentifiable. Each one carried a weapon. Not ceremonial, not standard security issue, military grade, configured for a closed room. For 1/2 second, the room froze. Then it erupted. 2 Keth warriors charged the intruders immediately, roaring, weapons raised, moving fast for their size. It was brave, and it was the wrong decision. The leading intruder was ready for exactly that response, and fired low, catching the first Keth at a joint in the leg armor. The warrior went down hard. The second Keth pulled up short, suddenly cautious, and that hesitation gave the intruders time to fan out. The Sorvani security team snapped into a tight protective circle around Lyra and the Sorvani delegates, which was exactly correct by their protocols. Protect the principal, hold position, wait for a clear line. The room was chaos. Delegates were shouting. The Keth negotiator had gone flat against the table. Junior officers were pulling people in different directions. Nobody had a clear picture of where everyone was. Nathan moved, but he did not move toward the intruders. He moved toward the civilian delegates. He crossed the room in a low, fast crouch, staying below the line of sight of the armed figures, and reached the cluster of smaller species observers first. A group of 4 non-aligned delegates who had no security escort and had simply frozen against the far wall. He got behind them, put one hand gently on the nearest one's shoulder, and said in a voice that was barely above a whisper, "I need you to move with me right now. Stay low, follow my hand, do not look at the weapons." He moved them to the secondary exit corner, not through it yet, because the corridor status was unknown, and put them flat against the wall behind a section of overturned seating that offered cover. Then he went back. He made 3 trips, 12 civilian observers, non-combat personnel, junior translators. Each time, low and fast, voice quiet and steady, no urgency in his tone, even though every part of him was reading the room and calculating. He kept his own sidearm holstered. Drawing it would have changed what he was, from someone moving people to safety, into another armed target for the intruders to track. On the 3rd trip, he saw the situation change. One of the intruders had broken away from the main push, and had worked their way around to the Sorvani side of the table. The protective circle was good, but it had not anticipated a flanking approach through the chaos. The intruder had a direct line to Vara, the lead Sorvani negotiator, who was still sitting at the table because she had refused to move. Pride, protocol, or both. The photograph of the 2 children was still in front of her. The intruder raised their weapon. Nathan was 15 feet away, with nothing between him and that moment. No clear shot, no cover option, no time for anything complicated. He stepped forward, into the open, hands slightly raised, sidearms still holstered. "Hey," he said, loud and clear and completely calm. "Look at me." The intruder's weapons swung toward him. He kept walking, slow, steady, not aggressive, not threatening. Just a man walking forward with his hands visible, talking in a voice that was somehow more present than anything else in the room. "Whatever you were paid for this job," he said, still walking, still calm. "It wasn't enough for what happens next if you pull that trigger in a room full of 31 delegations. Think about that for a second." He was buying time. 3 seconds. 5. 8. Lyra moved. She came out of the protective formation like something that had been wound tight and suddenly released. She covered the distance to the intruder in a movement that was so fast and so clean it was almost hard to follow. One precise strike at the weapon arm. A second movement that controlled the body. The weapon hit the floor. The intruder was face down in the next breath, and Lyra's knee was at their back with a calm and complete certainty that said the matter was finished. It was finished. The other two intruders were dealt with in the next 90 seconds by the combined Keth and Sorvani security teams, who had regrouped once the flanking threat was neutralized. The hall went from chaos to noise. Everyone was talking at once. Officers were calling for medical support. The Keth warrior who had gone down was alive, injured but stable. Delegates were being confirmed present and accounted for. Command channels were lighting up. Nathan was crouched beside the junior translator he had moved on the first trip, checking her for injuries she hadn't realized she had. She was shaking. He spoke to her quietly, asked her where it hurt, checked her arm where she had knocked it on the way down. He told her she had done well. He told her to breathe slowly. He did not tell anyone what he had done. He did not step forward in the shouting and debriefing that followed. He did not file a personal account of his role in the incident beyond a single brief line in the Joint Security Report. Liaison personnel assisted in civilian evacuation to secondary cover position during breach event. Vara, the Sorvani lead negotiator, saw him from across the room. She looked at the photograph on the table. She looked at Nathan. She said nothing, but her skin had shifted to a pale, warm gold. Lyra stood in the doorway of the negotiation hall with her eyes on Nathan across the crowded, noisy room. He was still on the floor beside the translator, doing the smallest, quietest work available to him after the biggest moment in the room. She had faced warriors from 9 species. She had been courted by generals. She had respected many soldiers and trusted few. She had never, in all of it, seen anyone step unarmed into a weapons line to buy time for someone else. Not for glory, not for record, not for anyone watching, just because it was the fastest option and he was willing. Something inside her shifted, like a lock that had always been closed, quietly deciding on its own that it no longer needed to be. No alien soldier could win her heart until a human showed true courage. Part 4. What courage actually looks like. The station went into full lockdown within 10 minutes of the breach. All non-essential personnel were moved to secure quarters. The summit was suspended. Every delegation was placed under guard, protective, not punitive, while the Joint Security Command tried to figure out what had just happened, and whether it was finished or only just beginning. It was not finished. The 3 captured intruders had been neutralized, but station security quickly determined that the breach team had entered through a compromised maintenance access point in the lower levels. The access point had been opened from inside. That meant there was at least one more person on the station who had helped them get in, someone who knew the layout, knew the schedules, and knew exactly when the main hall would be at its most crowded. Nathan had already sent a 3rd encrypted message to Earth before the lockdown even finished settling. This one had 3 names in it. Not accusations, observations. 3 individuals whose access logs he had noted over the past several days showed patterns that did not match their assigned roles. Small things. Things that individually meant nothing. Things that taken together pointed in a direction he had been watching for 5 days and did not want to be right about. He was right about them. The Joint Security Command confirmed 2 of the 3 within the hour. The third was still unlocated. Somewhere in the lower maintenance levels of the station, in the corridors built for pipes and power relays and the mechanical work that kept the whole structure alive, a loose end was moving. Nathan and Lyra were assigned to find it. The decision was made quickly and practically. They were the two best-suited officers for a quiet, confined search. No heavy Keth armor in narrow maintenance corridors, no large Sorvani unit that would telegraph movement through sound. Just two people who had already demonstrated in the past 10 days that they worked well without a lot of unnecessary noise. They suited up in light gear. Nathan checked his sidearm and his small handheld scanner. They exchanged exactly 4 words before entering the maintenance hatch. Primary route or secondary? Secondary, Nathan said. She went first. He followed. The lower maintenance levels of Station Verada were a different world from the polished diplomatic corridors above. The ceilings were low. The light was the cold, pale blue of emergency strips that ran along the floor. The air smelled of recycled atmosphere and hot metal. Everything was close and narrow and full of corners. Their footsteps made almost no sound because both of them moved the same way. Carefully, deliberately, one foot placed before the weight shifted. They moved for a long time without speaking. That was fine. Neither of them needed to fill silence. After about 40 minutes, they reached a junction point and stopped to consult the scanner. The reading was faint but present. A heat signature, approximately human-sized, moving slowly 2 corridors to the left. Lyra studied the scanner. Nathan studied the map in his head. He pointed left, she confirmed it with a nod, and they moved. It was in the next long stretch of corridor, waiting for the scanner to refresh, that she spoke. "Why did you step in front of that weapon unarmed?" she said. It was quiet but direct, the way Sorvani tended to ask things. No softening, no preamble. Nathan thought for a second. "It was the fastest option to create a delay," he said. "That is not an answer," Lyra said. She was not being harsh. She was being precise. There were other options. You could have drawn your sidearm. You could have moved to a flanking position and called the breach to the room. You chose to put yourself in the line of fire with no weapon raised. He was quiet for a moment. The scanner beeped softly. The heat signature had stopped moving. The negotiator had a photograph on the table. He said, "2 children. I saw it when we came in." Lyra waited. "I don't know why that mattered," he said. "It just did. I looked at that photograph, and I looked at the weapon, and everything else became very simple." Lyra did not respond immediately. They moved forward another 50 meters in silence, stepping carefully around a tangle of power conduits on the floor. "In Sorvani training," she said finally, "we are taught from early age that emotion in the field is a contamination of judgment. That the best soldier feels nothing except the mission." "Does it work?" Nathan asked. She considered the question seriously, which he appreciated. "It produces effective soldiers," she said. "Whether it produces good ones is a question my culture has not historically found useful to ask." He glanced at her. In the cold blue light of the corridor, her skin was a steady silver gray, calm, controlled. But there was a quality to her voice that he was learning to read, a slight reduction in its usual crispness that meant she was thinking about something she did not have a tidy answer for. "Every soldier who has tried to impress me," she said, and stopped. Started again. "I have been presented with battle records, with titles, with the heads of conquered enemies, which I found repulsive, with offers of political alliance dressed as admiration. Every one of them was performing something, showing me the largest version of themselves so that I would see it and be moved." She paused. "I have never been moved by any of it." "Because it was for you," Nathan said. She looked at him. "They were doing it so you would see them doing it," he said. "That's not courage. That's advertising." The corridor was quiet for a long moment. "Yes," she said. "That is exactly what it was." The scanner updated. The heat signature had moved again. Faster now, which meant it had heard or sensed something. Nathan held up one hand, and they both stopped, completely still. 30 meters ahead, behind a heavy utility door that opened onto a pressurized storage bay. They moved together toward the door, and in the way they moved, Nathan became aware, without analyzing it, that they had reached a kind of working rhythm that usually took soldiers months to build. She anticipated his angles. He read her pace. When he slowed, she slowed. When she shifted her weight, he was already adjusting. It was, in the cold blue light of the maintenance corridor, as natural as breathing. He took the left side of the door, she took the right. 3 silent counts, fingers shown, and they went through. The figure was cornered in the back of the storage bay behind a wall of sealed containers. He was Valoon, not the nervous quartermaster Nathan had helped days earlier, but another one, older, with the wide, frightened eyes of someone who had made a terrible decision, and now had nowhere to put it. He had no weapon visible. He had his hands up, almost before they entered the room. "I did not hurt anyone," he said. His translator chip rendered his speech into a thin, reedy voice. "I only opened the access point. I did not know they would do what they did. They told me it was a protest. They told me no one would be hurt." He was shaking. Nathan looked at him for a moment. Then he lowered his sidearm to a non-threatening angle and said, in a calm and even voice, "Okay, tell me exactly what happened from the beginning." Lyra looked at Nathan. He had not rushed the man, had not raised his voice, had not used the fear that was clearly available to him, in that moment, as a tool. The Valoon talked for 20 minutes. By the end of it, they had everything they needed: names, contact methods, how the coordination had worked, who had planned it, and from where. Nathan recorded every word, thanked a Valoon without irony, and called it in to Joint Security Command. On the walk back through the maintenance corridors, Lyra was quiet for a while. Then she said, "You could have frightened that information out of him in a fraction of the time." "Yes," Nathan said. "Why didn't you?" "Because he was already frightened enough," Nathan said. "Frightened people make mistakes in what they remember. And besides, he was quiet for a step or two. He was telling the truth. He made a bad decision, and someone used him. That happens." She looked at him in the pale blue corridor light. "What do you think courage is?" she asked. He thought about it for a genuinely long time. Long enough that she had almost decided he wasn't going to answer. "Doing what needs to be done," he said, "even when you're afraid, and even when nobody is going to know that you did it." Lyra's skin, in the low light of the maintenance corridor, did something she could not entirely stop. A thread of gold moved across her wrist and climbed briefly toward her elbow. Warm and involuntary, and unmistakably Sorvani in its meaning to anyone who knew their biology. She turned slightly away and pressed her fingers to the wall, as if checking a panel. By the time she turned back, it was gone. Nathan was looking at the map. He was probably just looking at the map. No alien soldier could win her heart until a human showed true courage. Part 5. The Accords, the Farewell, and the Choice. The remaining conspirators were identified within 12 hours of the Valoon's confession. They were not soldiers. They were financiers, a quiet network of investors and weapons traders from 4 different species, all of whom had grown very wealthy from the ongoing hostility between the Keth and the Sorvani, and all of whom stood to lose considerable income if a lasting peace was signed. They had hired the breach team through 3 layers of intermediaries. They had planned it carefully and patiently. They had been undone by a human lieutenant colonel who wrote his notes by hand and did not believe in ignoring small things. Station security made the arrests without incident. The summit was reinstated. The main negotiation hall was repaired, cleaned, and reopened within 2 days, and the lead delegations returned to the curved table beneath the gas giant sky, this time with an additional security arrangement that Nathan had personally recommended and Lyra had co-signed. No one argued with either of their names on it. The sessions that followed were different from the ones before the breach. Something had changed in the room. A quality of seriousness, maybe, or of gratitude, or simply of people who had looked at what almost happened and decided to work harder toward what they had come here to do. The Keth and Sorvani negotiators were still careful, still measured, still capable of long silences over difficult points. But they kept working. Day after day, they kept working. On the 17th day of the summit, the tricycle peace accords were signed. It was not loud. There was no explosion of celebration, no great ceremonial fanfare. The lead negotiators signed their respective documents in the custom of their people. Vara placed her palm flat on the agreement and let her bioluminescence bloom briefly across the page in a formal Sorvani gesture of commitment. And the Keth negotiator pressed a carved seal into a secondary document with the low, resonant sound of stone on stone. The observers along the walls were quiet. A few of the smaller species delegates were visibly emotional. The gas giant turned outside in its slow amber way, entirely unbothered, as it had been for 1 billion years. Nathan was standing along the eastern wall. He watched it happen with a calm expression, and his hands folded in front of him. Afterwards, when people were moving and talking, and the room was full of the particular energy of something important having just been accomplished, he found a quiet corner, sat down, and wrote a short message to Earth. It said, "Accord signed. All personnel secure. Coming home soon." He did not add anything else. The formal commendation from Lyra arrived in his security file that same afternoon. He read it once. It was precise and detailed, in the way Sorvani documents always were. It listed specific actions, specific outcomes, specific assessments of professional judgment. There was nothing sentimental in it. It was exactly the kind of commendation a respected officer writes for another respected officer, and it was the highest compliment she knew how to formally give. He sent back a one-line acknowledgement. Received with sincere thanks. It was a privilege to work alongside you. He meant it. The delegations began preparing to leave over the following 2 days. Ships were recalled to docking bays. Gear was packed. The diplomatic staff started the long process of archiving the summit records. The station, which had been so full of noise and tension and purpose, began to empty out, in the way places do after something significant has concluded, slowly, and with a slight feeling of hollowness that is not entirely unpleasant. On the final evening before the main departure window, Nathan went to the observation deck on the upper level. He had been there before, but usually briefly on his way to or from somewhere else. Now he had nowhere to be until morning, and the gas giant was doing something worth watching. A slow storm system was moving across its upper atmosphere, curling in deep violet against the amber, lit from below by some internal process that made the clouds glow faintly from inside. It was extraordinary. It was the kind of thing that made a person feel small in a way that was somehow more comfortable than feeling small on your own. He had been there for about 10 minutes when he heard her footsteps. He did not turn around. He already knew who it was. Lyra came to stand beside him at the window. Not close, but close enough. Her skin was the soft silver blue of someone who was calm, but not entirely settled. She looked at the gas giant for a moment without speaking. He let the silence be what it was. "I have been thinking," she said eventually, "about what I said in the maintenance corridor, about Sorvani training, about emotion being a contamination." "I remember," he said. "I have been thinking about whether I believe it," she said, "whether I ever believed it, or whether I was simply trained to say it until I stopped questioning it." Nathan was quiet, which was not agreement or disagreement. It was simply space. "I came to this summit," she said, "believing certain things about humans, that you were too young as a species, too emotional, too imprecise for serious work in a galaxy that rewards the strongest and the most calculated." She paused. "I was wrong." "You weren't entirely wrong," he said. "We are emotional, we make a lot of imprecise decisions. We're also very bad at long-term planning as a species, and we argue with each other constantly." She made a sound that might have been a very short laugh. "But," he said, and he looked at the storm in the gas giant's atmosphere, "I think emotion is not always a contamination of judgment. Sometimes it's the reason the judgment matters." She turned and looked at him. He was still watching the planet. His profile in the window light was calm and uncomplicated, and she thought, not for the first time, that he was one of the few people she had ever met who looked the same whether anyone was watching him or not. Just the same steady, thinking, present person at all times. "I have been offered a posting," she said. He looked at her then. "A joint operations coordination role in Sorvani neutral territory," she said, "near the border buffer zone that the Accords established. It is a new program. It will need people from multiple species to work closely together and build protocols from nothing." She held his gaze. "It needs a human liaison officer, someone with experience in multi-species security environments, someone who can work without a large support structure and who does not need to be the loudest person in the room to be effective." He was looking at her with a steady, quiet attention that she had come to understand meant he was taking something seriously. "That is a very specific set of qualifications," he said. "Yes," she said, "it is." The gas giant turned below them. The violet storm moved slowly across its face, glowing from inside, patient and enormous and entirely without agenda. "I would need to check my orders," Nathan said. "Of course," Lyra said. "And the posting timeline." "Of course. And whether Earth Command considers it a viable assignment." "Naturally," she said. A pause. "It is a 2-year posting, with renewal options." 2 years, he said. "In neutral territory," she said, "which I am told has reasonable living conditions and a surprisingly good view of the outer belt." He was quiet for a moment. Then he turned slightly toward her, and there was something in his expression that was warm and unhurried and completely unguarded in a way that made her skin respond before she could moderate it. Gold, at the wrist and the jaw, soft and unmistakable. She did not look away. "Neutral territory," he said quietly. "Sounds like it has potential." She held his gaze. Her skin was warm and gold in the observation deck light, and for once she let it be. Not suppressed, just present and real, and entirely her own. Neither of them spoke for a while after that. They stood at the window while the gas giant turned below them in its slow and ancient way, the storm moving across its face in quiet violet fire, and two people from different stars stood at the very beginning of something that neither of them had a word for yet. They did not need one. Not tonight. The accords were signed, the station was quiet, and somewhere in the space between two worlds, something small and true and rare had taken root. Not in a grand moment of declared feeling, but in 10 days of small honest actions, of problems fixed in empty corridors, of notes left for strangers, of an unarmed step forward into a weapons line, of a hand pressed to a corridor wall to hide something involuntary and gold. That was how it had grown. Quietly, without performance. The only way real things ever do.